All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the talk titled Building Community Capacity Using ABA Therapies, and I am hoping that the people on the stage will teach us exactly what that is, because I am not positive that I actually know. So this will be about an hour long, and I am Katie Stover. I'm part of the Alumni Council, and I'm just here to welcome everybody and then introduce who we have actually sitting here with us. We do have maybe a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end of the session. Hello, everybody up there. So if you do have a question, hold on to it, or I'm sure you can catch everybody right at the end of the session. All right. First up on our left, we have Kyle Leininger. He is a Vice President of Clinical Integration at Intermountain Centers, Arizona's largest not-for-profit health and human services company. Most of Kyle's clinical and administrative work has been aimed at helping people with behavioral excesses, including aggression, self-injury, substance use disorders, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. Kyle earned a master's degree in public health and administration from the University of Arizona School of Government and Public Policy. He received a bachelor degrees in both cognitive studies and Spanish and Latin American studies from Vanderbilt University. In addition, he has earned a behavioral support specialist certificate from the University of Arizona School of Psychology, Special Education, and Rehabilitation, and he is also a board-certified licensed behavioral analyst. There are some tongue twisters, and we did okay. All right, and then we have Ryan Colby, the class of 2007. He's the Vice President of Growth Operations at LME, which is focused on pediatric behavioral health. LME is building a better experience for families, providers, and payers. Ryan's team focuses on acquiring and onboarding families and providers quickly, in the right places, and at the right times. Before his work at LME, Ryan spent 7 years at Uber. I think you've heard of it. Where he has been promoted internally 4 times. His last role was serving as the director of the United States Marketplace Operations, where he led teams that managed U.S. ride-sharing city marketplaces. He also received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Anthropology at Amherst College, and he is the class of 2007, which is the same as mine, and I will not say anything embarrassing about Ryan. And then, last but not least, we have Amy Shaffer Post, class of 2002, and she is a social and emotional learning counselor at Mercersburg Academy. Before arriving on campus, she worked as a special education school social worker for 10 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Shippensburg University, as well as a master's of social work degree from also Shippensburg University. Amy has a specific interest in disorders related to executive functioning and holds a certificate as a clinical services provider in ADHD. So thank you very much, and Amy, take it away.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Wow, that was really loud. I was not prepared, sorry. So we thought we would start with just sharing how our paths over the last 20 and 15 years have led us to where we are today. So Kyle, would you like to start?
Sure. Okay, it's working. Good.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kyle Leininger, and I'm an O2 grad. Go O2. It's 20 years. How I got into the work that I do is a lot of trial and error. Nobody really talks about the kind of work that I do when you're kind of trying to figure out where you want to go with your career. But when I was always interested in health and wellness field, and I know that's part of what we're here to talk about today. When I think health and wellness, I think a lot about medical health. But what I learned in kind of the journey of finding out, the path to where I am today, is that there's a whole lot of emphasis also on behavioral health. And behaviors are related to healthy outcomes for all of us as human beings. And so I just became really interested in why do people do what they do, and how does that knowledge help you help others? So when I graduated college, I went to Hawaii for about a year, came back, and figured that I should probably get a real job at some point. I'd been a janitor, been working in a grocery store, really just kind of putting things off. And I met my wife in Tucson, and she was working at Staples, and she's like, you know what, I'm gonna go to law school, and I think you should get a real job. And so I was like, all right, I guess I will. I ended up working my first job in a group home for troubled adolescents, and it changed my life. I've been working at that company for the past 15 years, and started, like I said, in group homes, doing in-home support and counseling, crisis work, and eventually began to run a school for children with autism spectrum disorders, and later kind of got into the administrative role that I'm in today. So that's kind of the dithering way of saying how I got to where I am.
Straight and narrow path, right? How about for you, Ryan?
Sure. So, we did it too. I got Amy's mic here. So first thing I think to clarify, which I think we'll talk about a little bit as we get into this a bit more, is I am not a clinician. Kyle's got all the expertise, I think clinically on what we'll talk about. But I think my theme, and one of the things I think is important, that is least important to me, is I think the importance of learning and trying different things, and sort of an interdisciplinary approach to whether it's your career or to, in this case, we'll talk about ABA and ABA organizations and how we can expand access and help more families. Right, my career path also not really a straight line. Right, so I was class of 07, so 07. If we're doing that, we got some people from 07, which is great. So 15 years for me. Went to Amherst, studied economics and anthropology, which also have very little to do with ABA. Worked for a Major League Baseball team for a summer, which was a lot of fun. Then went and did economic consulting, where I got to do the very fun and rewarding work of helping banks pay less in lawsuits about mortgage-backed securities, which is great for learning skills, not as great for feeling like you're having a huge positive impact on the world. And then went and started working at Uber in 2014, when Uber was, we were only US based at the time with a few markets internationally, but a lot smaller obviously than it is today, much less ubiquitous. And I think it was really a fun, interesting challenge to join a startup and it was also the only company I'd ever seen that said we're actually looking for people who are economic consultants. No one really knows what that is. But Uber was looking for it and started there and spent sort of 7 years doing a bunch of different things. All of which sort of were heavily reliant on sort of data, technology, making marketplaces more efficient, and finding ways sort of at the core. And one of the things I'd love to share a little bit more about in the context of at least sort of the business side of ABA is, how do you give more of the value in a marketplace back to the participants of that marketplace, right? Like lots of businesses out there set up these big structures and bureaucracies and things that support these huge organizations, and sometimes that's necessary. But I think one of the nice things about running a marketplace, and this was true at Uber, was that you can basically give back all of the value that otherwise would have been taken by, whether it's a medallion owner for taxis or in any other business, like the sort of value that gets extracted by others, and you can give it back to the actual participants. And so when I was thinking about what to do after Uber, I think it was important to think about what organizations, be they companies, be they sort of nonprofits or whatever else, combine an important mission with a tremendous amount of ambition. And I think LME as an organization sort of was that. And although I knew nothing at the time about ABA or about autism, it was an opportunity to take some of what I thought I had learned at Uber and try to apply it in another important environment where I think there actually are some similarities. They aren't necessarily as apparent at first glance, but I think a lot of the things that you need to do in an in-home healthcare business are actually somewhat similar to the things you need to do for an organization or a business like Uber. And so it was a really exciting opportunity to take what I had learned, try to apply it to a totally new industry, a totally new world, and bring some of that sort of interdisciplinary approach. I don't know if you're going to ask yourself the question, but we have to ask you, Amy, too. What brings you here?
My path was pretty straight and narrow, actually, especially in comparison to that. I knew when I sat in Boone Hall 20 years ago what I wanted to be and where I wanted to be in life, and that was back here. But I also knew I wanted to be here in a counseling role. So I went to school, got my master's in social work, got a clinical license, worked in a variety of places, but always in the mental health field. I did crisis work in a hospital. I did traditional outpatient therapy, but where I really found my home was in the school system and working with youth. I love to work with children. adolescence especially is a really unique age. I think we all can probably point to the adults in our lives when we were here who helped shape us and mold us into the adults we are now. And I love being able to be in a position to help students grow and learn about themselves. So I was really excited last year. I actually applied for a position here just as a school counselor after Mrs. Rawhauser was retiring. And then they called and said, hey, we have this new position we're creating, and we want to talk to you about it. And as soon as I heard about it, my response was, I don't care if you hire me for the position. I'm so excited that Mercersburg is recognizing that our mental health, our emotional health impacts our ability to perform in the classroom. And that Mercersburg was saying, hey, we see this need, and we want to fill it, was really, really exciting for me to see the institution recognizing that and moving towards that. So I was thrilled when I was offered the position. It's been a really exciting, busy, and growing year for us. But we've done some great work, and we're going to keep doing great work here. So thanks for asking. So we have talked about ABA, and I promise we're going to even tell you what those initials stand for here in a second. But maybe we would just start with, what does ABA offer for participants that sets it apart from traditional talk therapy? I know. I'm sorry. Maybe I turned it off. Nope, I didn't.
Well, Ryan, actually, do you mind taking this question? I'd kind of like to hear from your perspective, somebody being an outsider, what you think.
So Kyle's just trying to play some games with me here. No, but I think,
Sorry.
so, I mean, first of all, ABA, as we get the slides up, stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. So really starts with the study of behavior and understanding sort of what sort of causes and what drives particular behaviors in individuals. And then trying to work, especially in the context, I think, of what we'll talk about, in a situation like autism or other conditions, how to help folks develop different behaviors, right? Like there's some behaviors that I think we would agree that we want to change and modify. There are others that I think are totally fine and might be different but are not harmful, right? But the sort of practice of ABA is really, how do we use these principles of behavior analysis to sort of shape and mold behavior in productive and healthy ways. But Kyle can fill me in where I got it wrong.
No, that was amazing. Well put. You should just drop the mic. Yeah, so, when people think about therapy, they generally think about one-on-one, in a room, talking with somebody about maybe some experience that you're having and trying to process kind of the thoughts, emotions, feelings that you might have relative to certain events in your life. With applied behavior analysis, the focus is primarily on overt behavior, so what people do. And so the applications of ABA are generally in kind of analyzing aspects of the environment that might be contributing to that person behaving in a particular way, and then trying to engineer that environment in a way to help support whatever pro-social, whatever kind of beneficial behavior can help that person. So I'll get back to this in just a minute as we walk through this, but the reality is that applied behavior analysis is often a very active therapy with very specific targets. And where there's really an emphasis placed on measurement and data to support an intervention, so to know whether you're having effect or not. But it just looks different than traditional therapy, and we'll probably describe what it looks like more with a young child with autism, because what it really looks like is just really fast, good teaching. And for parents, I think this is something that you said, Ryan. Maybe you can say it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just think like a lot of what, effective parenting often just kind of looks like people practicing ABA. They just don't necessarily know it, right? I think what Kyle talked about, right? I think there's, it looks like it's fast teaching. It also can look like play, right? Like, and it actually is in many cases play, right? You're using a child or a sort of client's environment, and sort of engaging really directly and deeply with them on a one-to-one basis to sort of coach and help sort of move folks in the right direction.
Yeah. I think we'll drill down more into that.
I was going to say, I think it's time we explain to them. We stop the
We can do it.
suspense and say, what is ABA?
All right. So as long as people have been living, they've been behaving. And our very natures, the cooperative part of us, the pro-social part of us, the compassionate part of us is, manifest in places like this. And it's, we can usually point to things that our good behavior has done. But all of us, every single one of us has misbehaved as well. Misbehavior doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing, but it just means maybe a behavior in a particular context that doesn't fit. I know that there's faculty and other alumni here that could probably attest to my misbehavior in my senior year.
Just your senior year?
Really, my senior year? Well, no, it's probably the whole time.
We can agree on that one.
Yeah, okay, cool. But behavior analysis tries to answer the question of, why do people do what they do? Why do people do what they do? Is it, some kind of external, force? Is it our genes? Are we, the byproduct of our parents and, our uprearing? Well, in the early 20th century, an American psychologist by the name of John B. Watson was trying to answer that question and took a different approach, which is looking at, through a scientific lens, how the environment influences behavior. And that is really kind of the start to, what we now refer to as applied behavior analysis. Move on from John B. Watson, and you get Ivan Pavlov. You all know him. You got the dogs to salivate over a bell. You've got B.F. Skinner, who taught some pigeons to play ping pong. Pretty impressive. But what ended up really being of greater value to the world, and kind of what kind of took shape, was, why aren't we doing this with people? Why are we only doing it with animals? And so thus was born applied behavior analysis, which is the application of scientifically derived behavioral principles to socially significant behavior. And what is socially significant is really relevant to people. And so applied behavior analysis takes what was learned in the lab over 60 years, 50 years, and applying it to people's learning and people's behaviors. You can move to the next slide. So these are the...
The only thing I was just going to reinforce there that I think you noted that I think is important to double click on, or like to reinforce, is you said data driven, right? I think behavior analysis is incredibly data driven, right? Like when we talk about what this actually looks like, right? It's people engaging in this sort of back and forth sort of teaching environment with another person, and they're taking like very copious data and notes on it all the time. And it is a very sort of scientifically based, data driven endeavor. And so I think that's just worth highlighting. I think you also are going to talk a little bit more probably about sort of what it means to be a socially significant behavior, right? It's not just, I want someone to do something a little bit differently. It's like typically the things that you would use and you would practice ABA with are very significant, important things to learn. And so, we wouldn't necessarily, maybe you would use it to teach somebody ping pong, but usually in the context, like the pigeons, but usually in the context of the way it's practiced. In sort of this sort of like clinical setting, it's typically things that are quite important or sort of quite significant and of consequence.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was really well put. Yeah, social significance is kind of the key word there. What is socially significant? Changes over time, changes in context. And I think that word is thrown in there, primarily to adjust and be flexible to the fact that what is socially significant, does change over time. For people with autism, socially significant might be learning to speak. It might be learning how to navigate an environment independently so that you don't need as much help. Kind of living the life that you want to live. In some of the spaces I practice, like in substance use disorders, it's Socially significant behaviors might be living, having meaningful relationships with your family, or getting a job. So socially significant really can apply to so many different areas of life. I think what I was going to say here is I was going to just say that these are the guys that took behaviorism out of the lab with animals and started applying it to human. It's Todd Risley, Montrose Wolfe, and Donald Baer. This is like a seminal article from 1968. So that's really when it was born. And they started really using it primarily with children with developmental and cognitive disabilities. But that isn't the only area that they applied the science in. This is an article that just came out in May, and these researchers, Heward and colleagues, just kind of describe how now applied behavior analysis has been used in 350 different domains. So whether it is teaching the best swimming stroke, or whether it's helping somebody learn a safety skill on the job, whether it's substance use disorders or autism, this science is transdiagnostic, and it can be helpful in a lot of different areas. This is the study that, and this will be real brief about this, but this is a study that really resulted in a burgeoning industry that LME and others, my organization, have been really interested in as well. In 1987, Ivar Lovaas out of UCLA started working with young children with autism and provided between 25 and 40 hours a week of therapy. You probably can't read that very well, but what they found in their small N study was that 47% of the children that were involved were able to go from special education classrooms to general ed. Their IQ scores went from being lower than average to being normal or above average. And they showed that these children, their behavioral profiles didn't really correlate with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis anymore. So this was really the first study that showed the power of applied behavior analysis in serving kids with autism, and it has become the gold standard treatment. And that's really kind of what we're going to talk about today, because there are also challenges associated with the approach, both on a business side, but also on a cultural side, and kind of the side of like, what does it mean to be human? So we'll probably get a little bit into that today.
Getting very philosophical very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to do it sometimes.
That's tremendous, the results to see someone's IQ score go up and their behaviors no longer reflect a diagnostic criteria it's really, really significant. When as a clinician we're looking to diagnose someone, typically you can think about it, in order to receive a diagnosis, whatever you're experiencing is impeding your ability to live a happy, fruitful, successful life. And so if you think about someone who has been identified as being on the autism spectrum and then no longer meets that criteria, that's really exciting news and really hopeful news. That's terrific. So we've talked about how this ABA uses science and is very science-based. And Ryan, you mentioned this earlier. And so just for the sake, I know some of us probably have people that we love in our lives who are on the spectrum and that we can think about ABA for, but not all of us. So you referenced that this is effective parenting. Can you speak a little bit more about how maybe, the untrained can use ABA when we go home with our spouses, our children, to help change behavior?
So I think one thing that, I don't know if you want to sort of walk through or not, right? I think some of the concepts that are at least helpful for me, right, are like, antecedent behavior consequence or reinforcers or things like that start to explain it. I don't know if you want to walk through those.
Sure. Briefly, there's kind of a formula that B.F. Skinner, came up with that we follow today, and it's related to those basic behavioral principles that we described. When we're doing an analysis of a behavior, it seems so simple, as I said, but it's known as the ABCs. And what we're doing is we're looking at the temporal relationship between somebody's behavior, what happened right before, what events were occurring in their environment, and then what happens right after that behavior occurs. And as you, over time, kind of look at each kind of ABC, every time the behavior occurs, you kind of see patterns. And those patterns tell you about what kinds of interventions might be helpful for that individual. But as a parent, I have my 2 kids up in the audience. Well, one now. Yeah, he had to go. I use this stuff every day. It's, it's when my child, Molly's up there. Hi, Molly. You're doing a great job, by the way. So what I just did there is use the ABCs. I noticed that Molly is sitting there quietly watching me, and I am reinforcing her for sitting there. So I'm just letting her know that that's something that I really like and that I'm happy about. And most kids are like that. Most kids want their parents' approval, right? But there's other things that everybody finds reinforcing as well. But I guess that's just an example in a parenting format.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really helpful just to think of it, right? You can kind of think of it as feedback, right? Like a reinforcer is feedback. It can take the form of verbal feedback. It can take the form of, you display sort of the behavior you're looking for, and you get to play with your favorite toy, or you get, you may not want to use this one as often, right? But like you get a snack, right? Or you get some sort of candy that you really like, or whatever the sort of reinforcer or sort of piece of feedback is that sort of resonates with the child. And I think a lot of what behavior analysts do is, right, break this down very granularly, take really good data on it, deeply understand it, and come up with very customized strategies for this child. This is a reinforcer that works for this particular behavior, and really builds on that to sort of build the right, or sort of build healthier behavior patterns over time.
So what I described was like a strategy that I was just using with Molly. But if it was a client, right, or somebody that I was working with, I would also be taking data on how she responded. Did I see an increase in her being able to sit and watch Dad and look attentively? And so if she was doing that more, then I would say that maybe that social praise is a good idea. Maybe I should do more of that. Nice job, Molly. Thank you. You're the best. So as a behavior analyst, that's what we do, is we're kind of looking at every single behavioral opportunity and instance, and we're kind of seeing whether or not, we're getting the socially significant behavior that we'd like to see.
And you can break it, right? I think the way that you would do this clinically, right, I think is you do an initial assessment, right? And so I think what Kyle did was like a sort of quick reassessment of the situation. Like if you're working with a new client or you're trying to figure out a strategy for how to teach your child to do X or sort of change thing Y, you basically build a treatment plan that might include what I'm going to do is work on these things, and here are some of the strategies I'm going to use to work on these things. And then you sort of take it into practice and you say, the first, you might think of it, well, at least the way that I think of it is there are, broadly speaking, 2 types of things you might try to do. You might try to reduce a problematic behavior, or you might want to increase skill acquisition, where like an acquired skill could be related to feeding, right? I've learned how to feed myself, or I've learned how to use the toilet, or things like that might be skills that you'd acquire. A problem behavior could be something that's self-harm or something else that they're doing that you want to change. And in each of these cases, you've sort of built a plan to address it, and you've said, these are the things that we're going to try. You find a good sort of reinforcer to sort of build towards the behavior that you're looking for. And then you sort of practice it over time. You take data on how the improvement looks. And then over time, over 1, 2, 3, 6 months, you can see really exciting progress. And I think, this is something Kyle and I started talking about earlier today. It's one of the really exciting things in the data that sort of we see when you look at you look at the results and the outcomes that you get for children with this. You see really substantial reductions in problem behavior over time. So we look at these curves, and it's, month 1, you see sort of 0 or 10 or 15 or 20% reduction in problem behavior. And over 6 months, you can get 75, 80% reductions in the behavior that you're looking to target with techniques like this. And sort of as you figure out what works, you sort of build on that, and you sort of move on to the next thing, and you can see the sort of progress along the way. So it's just really rigorous, thoughtful, highly data-oriented parenting in some ways.
Put it really well, yeah.
So going back more to the clinical aspect, Kyle, you mentioned earlier, we've talked about autism a little bit, and you also said something briefly about substance use. What disorders are treated well with ABA? What kinds of things have you focused on?
Yeah, substance use has been kind of the newest practice area for me. And, these principles apply to any human behavior. A lot of times when people are using substances, they find that they're missing out on things that were really important to them. Mm-hmm. There's kind of this saying, it's like if punishment worked, or if punishment alone worked, we'd probably have very few addicts. People that go through substance use disorders, really, they experience a lot of punishment, yet they can't stop. We kind of take that ABC approach that I just described, and I would have like kind of a talk. It looked like more like a talk therapy session. Mm-hmm. Help somebody like recognize that pattern. Did you recognize that like when this antecedent happened, right? You got in an argument with your dad. That was when you reached out to Bobby to go like get high. Mm-hmm. And then what was the result of that? Well, I felt better. I felt I wasn't as like stressed out, or I wasn't as angry. And so those ABCs really apply to so many different populations and to ourselves. The only other thing that I'd mention is that with substance use work, and I think this applies to kids with autism too, the whole point of this has to be, from a therapeutic standpoint, about helping people live the best life that they can live and that they want to live. Mm-hmm. There's like the golden rule and the platinum rule. Have you heard this? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the golden rule is, treat someone the way that you want to be treated. The platinum rule is treat somebody the way they want to be treated. And so regardless of what approach or what population you're working with, that's something that I always try to keep in mind, and that's absolutely essential. But aside from substance use disorders, the domains are limitless. One area that's really interesting is organizational business management. There are a number of behavior analysts that work in the business environment to improve retention, kind of improve systematic delivery of high quality standards in a particular product. There's really just so many applications.
I know right before I came here, it was a big push in the public school system to get more BCBAs in because they just offer a very different perspective, and I think a more global perspective, right? What you're describing is something that is done in the classroom all day without teachers always recognizing the science behind it. But I think what teachers also don't recognize is to look at the C. So you looked at Molly and saw she responded positively, so you knew you should continue to do that. But not all children are going to respond positively to just verbal praise, right? Or depending upon how enjoyable the behavior is, you might need to up your reward. And so having that data that you guys have talked about is so important. And the application is so true. So
really, really briefly, Amy, one thing we should just touch on too. So Amy used the acronym BCBA. I don't know if we've defined BCBA, but Kyle's a BCBA, which is Board Certified Behavior Analyst. Do you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Sure. So the Board Certified Behavior Analysts are certified under the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. The credential itself is relatively new, started in the 90s. When I started in Arizona, I'm the 135th behavior analyst in Arizona. Now there's around 800. So and that was 2014. So we've just seen a dramatic increase in the number of BCBAs. But BCBAs are their scope is not limited by any particular diagnosis. It's really about the focus on overt behavior for the most part, and doing environmental and contextual analyses to help support people.
Awesome. So we have touched on autism. Perhaps we can take just a minute to describe what autism is, what it means to have autism.
Yeah, sure. So autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder or disability, and it can impact various aspects of one's life. primarily what you see are impacts in social skills, so the acquisition of social targets or communication is usually impacted. And then we also tend to see repetitive or restrictive patterns of behavior that also kind of characterize the disorder. It is defined in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, so just kind of like depression or anxiety is. And it impacts people in very different ways. So up until this most recent edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, you had, many of you might have heard of Asperger's, autistic disorder, pervasive developmental disorder. Well, when they moved into the DSM-5, they collapsed all of that. So there no longer is like Asperger's or autistic disorder separately. They've all been combined into one diagnosis, which is autism spectrum disorders. But the other thing I'll say is that usually when people think of Asperger's, they think of like somebody who's high functioning, right? You know, that term is really fallen out of favor. And it's now, when you look at the DSM, it characterizes people's needs by level 1, 2, and 3. And so 1, 2, 3 doesn't have to do with the severity of your symptoms, but it has to do with the support you need. So level 1 would be you need some support, right? Level 2 is like you need moderate to substantial level of support. Level 3 being you need significant and substantial support. And that looks so different. Somebody could be talking, walking, able to navigate their environment seemingly, but still be a level 3 if their repetitive or restrictive behaviors really got in the way of them living a quality life. So I think that's kind of the basics of autism. But I really like this graph here, or excuse me, this graphic. It shows kind of how the core areas can affect people differently. So, communication difficulties, social impediments, intense focus and interests, sensitivities, routine and repetition. You can kind of see that they're manifest in different ways depending on how somebody's, how serious the impairment might be. And you can see here that the number of people with autism has drastically increased. I think when I started, like in 2014, it was, I think, 1 in 88, and now it's 1 in 54. Some estimates even put it lower, or so where the prevalence is greater, excuse me. So you can kind of see this graph, how, it really has been a dramatic increase. Some things that I just wanted to note, though, is that even though you're seeing this increase, it might not actually be that there are more people with autism. There are impacts, from awareness campaigns. Autism Speaks or Autism Society of America have done a really good job bringing awareness. And because we're more aware, people are getting evaluated more. And when people are evaluated more, we tend to see an increase in the number of diagnoses.
And I think the other thing that you touched on, right, I think there was, many of you have probably heard the phrase that I find just helpful as a reminder that, as Kyle was talking about before, people say if you've met a person with autism, you've met one person with autism, manifests incredibly differently. And I think we were talking about these data a little bit earlier. There are some, I think, really interesting nuances to this as well across regions. And then we should also have Kyle taught me earlier today about where the data come from and how they're actually created, which is fun. But there are vast differences in, for example, the sort of rate here in California versus the rate in, I think one of the other examples is Mississippi, where in California, the prevalence looks 3 times higher. But there's also substantially more probably awareness and access to diagnosticians and just general understanding in some states versus others. So it's difficult to tease out, is this an actual difference in prevalence versus a difference in awareness and diagnosis?
Yeah. Oh, great point.
So, Kyle, do you think you could walk us through what ABA looks like in practice?
Sure. So if we're talking about with a young child with autism, we're kind of talking about the services that are described in that EVAR-LOVAS Ivar Lovaas study. And it can kind of take a couple different forms. One is there is like oftentimes like table time, where you're working with a young kid on identifying shapes or matching or maybe doing like some kind of like playing Simon Says. Essentially, it's like touch your head, and if the child is responding appropriately, then you're reinforcing in some way. Whether it's like a token board, so if they answer correctly, they get something on their token board, and then at the end, you celebrate together. If a child isn't responding appropriately, then that's where the instructor really has like the opportunity to prompt in a variety of ways. So they can, if they're trying to teach a motor imitation skill, like touch your head, they might like prompt the child to touch their head, and then give them tickles or like spinning around in a chair, something kind of fun. And then then we also have a variety of other different types of prompts that we might use to help the child be successful and help them also understand that adults are really fun. We have access to all kinds of things and we love playing with you. So there's like that kind of table time format, right? And we're usually working on maybe 25, 30 targets in a session. Mm-hmm. The other way is play, which is kind of what you were referring to. And that's really my preference in terms of how to teach skills. Basically at our clinic, we have a really large room filled with tons of really fun stuff. And the way that you get to access that fun stuff is by communicating in some fashion, whether it's a sign, whether it's, in the beginning when kids aren't talking at all, just a sound. And then following their lead and building upon the games that they're creating. So they're kind of try to understand the cause and effect aspect of it. So that's kind of like the basic idea. It's a lot of floor time. It's a lot of like, I would go to work in like, shorts and sneakers, because you're getting down on the ground, you're getting bubbles, all over you. And it's a lot of fun. But that can happen in a clinic-based setting. It can happen in a home-based setting. And imagine having somebody in your home 25 to 40 hours a week, how tough that would be just to let, a person who heretofore has been, a stranger into your home, all in the service of like helping your child kind of live up to their potential, whatever that is. So I hope that paints a little bit of a picture. Yeah. Did you have something?
Yeah, no, I think I would just echo a little bit of what Kyle said too, just to sort of touch on what this I think actually means practically, right? You mentioned 25 to 40 hours. Like this is a pretty substantial time commitment for families, for the children involved, for the clinicians as well, right? So that 25 to 40 hours a week looks like, 2, 3, 4 hour sessions, sometimes twice a day. And so I think it is really, I think, a remarkable amount of commitment from the sort of clinicians who carry it out, as well as from the families and the kids who sort of work through it. But I think the results are pretty unequivocal. But it's a tiring, tough go.
It's a commitment, it sounds like, for sure, but a very successful one when it's done correctly and done well. So I've heard of ABA before. I'm very familiar with it, but I work in the clinical world. I'm just curious, like just a show of hands, how many of you had ever heard of ABA or knew about applied behavior analysis before today? So some, but not most. So I think that's a reflection. One, it's a fairly new thing, and I understand that. But we've talked beforehand, there's not a lot of people out there, like you talked about how much the BCBA has grown, but there's not a lot of people offering ABA. Why? If it's so successful, what's getting in the way of our ability to access it?
Well, I think, definitely Ryan's going to talk a lot about that and some really cool work that his organization is doing to help address some of those challenges. But we definitely have a pipeline issue. Like I said, I didn't get into the field because somebody told me about how great ABA was. I kind of stumbled upon it by accident. And I think that's how most people come into contact with behavior analysis. It's like you're working at a school and you've got a PBIS team. If you don't know what PBIS stands for, it's Positive Behavior Intervention and Support, and is one of the most effective system-wide approaches to improved behavior on any given campus. or you maybe worked with a kid with autism and somebody's like, oh, their ABA therapist is coming later. You're like, oh, what's an ABA therapist? So I think that's part of the issue, is that people hadn't heard of it before. And then I also think, another challenge is, it's fairly recent that insurance companies are reimbursing for the service.
Oh.
And so the industry that has kind of is just coming to fruition did not have the resources available to fund it in the public sector or the private commercial insurance sector. The only thing I would mention is, like, imagine if you knew this therapy was out there and your insurance didn't cover it. I mean, we know a lot of families who are paying, taking out second mortgages for this stuff. And so I'm so thankful that we're at that point, but we still have work to do to try to grow the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kyle summarized it really well. As an example, right, on the insurance point, the Medicaid program in Texas didn't cover ABA until this year, as an example. I think the Illinois Medicaid program still doesn't cover ABA, or is sort of in the early stages of it. And private insurance companies generally have for a little bit longer. But I think certainly that's a gap, and I think, like Kyle noted, right, you start to add up the costs here. If you're talking about 25 to 40 hours of therapy a week, you sort of do the math on all that, and you're talking about an annual commitment from a family. If they have to pay out of pocket, you're talking about an annual commitment of $50,000, which is obviously a pretty insurmountable number for most people without the support of insurance. Kyle also talked about, right, like the prevalence of clinicians. So the BCBA certification, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is growing quite quickly. So I think from 2020 to 2021, I think it grew by, say, 20%. So the number of total clinicians with the BCBA certification went from something like 40-something thousand, I think, to 55,000 BCBAs from 2020 to 2021. So it's growing quite rapidly, but you look at the sort of growth curve of this thing, and Kyle mentioned you were, BCBA 150 in 2024, and it's probably 7x'd since then in Arizona. So, and that's just in 8 years. So the field, like the practice, I think the science is actually not that new, but I think the funding for it is relatively new, and therefore the sort of number of clinicians is relatively new. And I think the source of clinicians being relatively new is actually there being academic programs that train people for this. And so I think we've also seen a bit of an explosion in the number of academic institutions that actually will train people. In some cases in actual ABA, so you can get a master's degree in ABA now, which I think is, I don't know how, that's pretty new, I think. I don't actually know.
It was really rare. And I think speaking also to other programs, when I was an undergrad, the dominant kind of sector of psychology has been cognitive psychology, and that's what my background was prior to getting into behaviorism. But that's what they taught at Vanderbilt. Nobody really talked about you could go this behavioral route. And I think that's kind of changing a little bit. There are more programs, like you said.
Absolutely. So I think you spoke to this slide. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure we...
Yeah, no, this one, I think we could also spend a minute on that one if you want, just in terms of, just to give context to the problem. So we talked about access and sort of access gaps here. This chart on the left is just a rough estimate, right? So actually, we should start even back up a little before that. Kyle talked about the fact that ABA can be used for, can be leveraged in any number of circumstances for all sorts of different conditions. And I think related to that, I think it's probably fair to say that not every child with autism would necessarily benefit from ABA, or you would necessarily have a sort of fully fledged 15, 20, 30 hour a week program for every child with autism. But just to give some rough sense for the scale of the problem, the bar chart, the sort of column on the left is a rough estimate based on the latest CDC numbers of the number of children under the age of 18 who might be diagnosed with autism. This is like something like 1.6 or 1.7 million, I think, based on my count. And then the other two bars are the number of clinicians in the United States who are licensed to actually provide ABA services. So A BCBA is what we talked about. The BCBA typically they have a master's degree, tons and tons of supervision time, and generally speaking, a BCBA might be able to work with, let's say, 8 to 10 to 12 children at any one time, sort of not concurrently, right? They're not going to like have 12 children running around. But at any one time, they might be able to sort of oversee or supervise, say, a dozen cases at once. And RBT is sort of the registered behavior technician certification. And these are folks who are actually doing a lot of what Kyle was describing earlier, right? They're on the floor playing with and sort of working through the actual ABA therapy. The BCBAs are developing the treatment plans. They're overseeing the supervision, or so they're overseeing the therapy. It's the RBTs who actually go and do a lot of it, although some BCBAs will as well. And typically, an RBT might work with, on average, 2 families at once. So if the therapy is 20 hours a week, an RBT is going to work 40 hours a week, right? We can do the math. You can work with typically 2 families. There are about 120,000 RBTs in the United States. So we're a little bit short on the number of RBTs that we would need, even just if you wanted to have every child with autism in the United States getting ABA therapy. So there's a pretty substantial gap in what we can actually serve today. Kyle, anything I missed or anything you want to note?
No, I guess one thing I wanted to just note for, I care about this too, being a taxpayer. But, if you kind of look at the cost-benefit analysis of like what it is we're talking about, take away the human aspect, which is obviously the most important to me. But, if a kid gets 2 to 3 years of this therapy, the cost of $150,000, you can mitigate the average life cost, which is around $3.5 million for serving somebody, for treating and supporting somebody with autism that has a significant disability. So I guess I just wanted to point out that there's some major societal benefit that can come from people having broader access to this.
Yeah, and I think, Kyle, we were talking a little bit earlier about the work that you're doing on like value-based contracts and things like that. So value-based healthcare being a potential, maybe a potential solution here, but at least my limited understanding as a relative newbie to the field is that unlike some other conditions and other treatments, ABA is relatively early in its ability to actually leverage and develop value-based contracts. And so that's one way that you might be able to unlock more funding down the road if we can have a more clear, sort of better demonstration of the value. I think one of the other things that I understand to be a challenge there is in order for a value-based contract, which is a provider basically saying we'll sort of share the risk with the health insurance provider, and we'll demonstrate that we're saving you money in the long term by providing this care now. One of the challenges with doing that with ABA is that if you think about it from the purely rational business perspective, people change health insurance all the time, and children who are getting this care under their parents' health plans may not work with the same health care provider or the same health insurer when they're adults and would actually be incurring a lot of the costs. So I think there's like an incentive and economic issue in sort of how we align the needs of families and the real societal benefits that Kyle talked about with the ability of the current health insurance environment to actually pay for it.
So for people that aren't really familiar with risk arrangements, what do you mean by that? Can you talk a little bit more about what risk takes for an insurance company?
Yeah, so I mean, you've got more expertise on this than I do, so you should fill in a lot of it too, right? I think there are sort of broadly 2 ways that you might, as a healthcare company, that you might get paid for your services. One is fee for service, which is actually most of what the healthcare industry operates on, which is you provide a particular service. That service comes with a per hour rate or a per 15-minute rate. And you provide the service, you get paid for it. In value-based care, you're basically trying to demonstrate that for a certain population of people that this healthcare plan serves, by providing the care that we provide, we can actually reduce the total cost for the health insurance plan to serve that population over the medium to long term. So you can get this care now. We will actually save you. We, the healthcare company, will save you, the insurance company, money in the medium to long term. And we should be paid sort of based on the savings that we're providing, not based on the simple fee-for-service model. I think it sounds like, in my conversation with Kyle, they're doing some really interesting stuff on that at Intermountain, given the care they're able to provide.
Yeah, an example would be, things that are really costly for people with autism that maybe are on kind of the that level 3, have really substantial needs, is like going to the emergency department or going to inpatient stays for many, many, many days. That can be really costly financially, not to mention the impact that it has on families. And if ABA can help, if it can be demonstrated to help keep people out of that level of care, then, insurance companies are like, yeah, that's a really good investment for us. And so those value-based arrangements are set up where they're like, hey, if you, can demonstrate that this population of people with autism are going less to the emergency department, we'll give you a little bit of the money that we saved. And so we have skin in the game. The way it's going to work, though, in the future, which is kind of scary a little bit, is like, maybe they're paying us, let's just say $100 for a service right now, and they're giving us this little bonus for saving some money. An insurance company could say, well, you did so good last year that we're going to pay you $80, and the rest of the $20 you can earn if you keep people out of the emergency room. So that's probably what value-based arrangements will look like in the future. So, but anyways, it's kind of an aside, but kind of an interesting reality of the work that we do.
And the dark side of healthcare that none of us really want to talk about, right? The insurance companies. Sorry if any of you own insurance companies. So we are almost out of time. Yeah, quick hour. I think a great way to wrap up is, you've shared some really powerful data about this service. If any of us are interested in learning more, maybe we know someone that we love and care for that could really benefit, where do we go? Who do we turn to?
Well, you can always call, Ryan or I, and we'll help you navigate. You know a lot about different parts around the country. I'm starting to as well.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, like step one, typically in these situations, is talk to your primary care, sort of your pediatrician. But I think that's another thing that gets into a challenge here. We don't have enough people who can diagnose autism, so the waiting list for getting a diagnosis can be years long at times, which is obviously a problem. So I think that's one great resource, right? And certainly you can always reach out to Intermountain or to Elmi, and folks will be able to help. But I think there are lots of other good organizations, like Autism Speaks, I think has done a lot of really good work. And if you want like a relatively straightforward, simple sort of explanation of sort of what, either what autism is or what ABA is and how it works, I actually think that Autism Speaks has a pretty good website that actually can explain things in a fair amount of detail. I also hesitate to say this, and Kyle may disagree with me. I actually think what has been helpful for me as someone who has never been a practitioner on the ground doing this is actually finding relatively reputable, or not relatively, but very reputable sources on like YouTube to actually watch what this looks like. So like one organization that is a relatively large ABA provider is called Hope Bridge, and they have like a bunch of videos of what ABA looks like and some of the principles. So I actually think there's some good resources out there if you just make sure you find the ones that are good, as with any sort of information on the internet.
For adults, I think Autism Speaks does a really nice job for kids. But if you're an adult with autism, or you refer yourself as an autistic adult, I think Autism Society of America is who I would probably recommend. They have a national network that can really help plug people into services. And autism doesn't go away. I think we kind of hear the term like ABA can cure autism, and I don't believe that. And for the 50% of the kids in the Ivar Lovaas study who didn't make the kinds of gains that maybe others did, they may still need support. And so adults need that support as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I thank you all so much, or you both, for taking time today to talk with us. We are out of time, but I know you guys probably would be available for some questions if anybody had some afterwards to come up. Would that work?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.